This happened to my dad during the 80s when he was a kid, maybe around 10 years old. One day, my dad was home alone as his parents, aka my grandparents, had left the house to go to a work company event for about an hour or so, which meant that my dad would be home alone. Sometime while his parents were gone, he was in his room doing some homework to keep him occupied when he got this strange, unknown feeling, as if he were being watched. He tried to forget about it by focusing on his homework, but he couldn't shake off this feeling no matter how many times he tried. At one point, the feeling went away and he proceeded to continue his homework when a few papers fell off as he was sitting near the edge of his bed. He reached down to get his papers, but before he could, he felt a cold hand grab onto his wrist and start pulling. My dad started screaming at the top of his lungs, loud enough to get the neighbors' attention. Somehow, my dad made whoever was under his bed let go of him, and he then ran to the neighbor's house to call the police. However, just like in most situations like this, when the police arrived, the person was already gone and the window was left wide open. Police say that it was either most likely a homeless person looking for shelter or a burglary. Either way, my dad was horrified. My dad still talks about the story till this day, and he still thinks about what would have happened to him had he not been able to get away. When I was in my early 30s, I worked the night shift as a janitor at a local community college outside of Pittsburgh. I liked my job for the most part, as it was a pretty chill job because you didn't have to do much. Basically, you'd have to pick up trash students left behind, mop floors, and make sure all of the rooms were locked. During the night shifts, I'd often have at least 2 or 3 other fellow janitors working with me in separate buildings. But there was this one night where I was the only janitor on duty. I went around building to building, doing my usual routine of sweeping the floors and picking up trash. At one point, I go into the building where all of the classrooms are located and notice that one of the classroom lights were now on. I was confused and figured that I might have forgotten to turn it off, but I then came to the realization that I never checked this part of the building. At this point, I'm practically in panic mode, and I made my way over to go investigate. I looked inside of the classroom, expecting to see a student or perhaps another staff member, but I instead saw a man crouched down behind one of the metal cabinets, staring directly at me. The strange part was that he didn't even look like a student. He looked to be in his mid-50s or possibly early 60s. He wore a pair of jeans, a plaid t-shirt, and had long, messy hair, as if he were homeless. I wasn't sure as to what to do, but the most logical decision was to call the police and report it. I walked out of the building to go call the police, and they then came within a few minutes. They walked up with me to the classroom where I saw the man, but by that point, he was already gone. Police did a thorough sweep around the campus trying to find him, but they never did. A few days later, I found out from one of the security guards that a man in his mid-50s had murdered his wife and had supposedly disposed her body near the college, and he hasn't been seen since. His description of the man was almost identical to the man I saw in the classroom that night, even the appearance. I haven't told anyone else about my encounter, but till this day, I'm convinced that the man I saw that night was in fact responsible for his wife's death. It still freaks me out knowing that it could have came to a close encounter with a killer. When I was around maybe 17 or 18 years old, my family and I had moved out of our hometown in California to a relatively rural area in Colorado. We had previously lived in Los Angeles, but seeing as we hated major cities, we had to move elsewhere. The house we had moved into wasn't anything too special. It was just an ordinary house right next to a national forest preserve. I'll admit, it was pretty nice being isolated from anyone else, but it sometimes got a bit boring. Thankfully, about a week after we had moved in, my younger sister and I managed to discover a small swimming hole not too far away from the house. It wasn't private property or anything, so we would often find ourselves going there a few times a week. The nice thing about it was that it was surrounded by forest in all directions, so it was very well hidden unless you were really looking or knew where it was. Our parents didn't mind us kids going over there by ourselves as long as we told them when we were going and when we'd be back. It was a decent sized swimming hole, and the only thing we had to be careful of was the treacherous rocks at the bottom. One day, I had came home from school depressed as I was visiting my friends back in Cali and needed some time to myself. My parents were not home and it was a sunny day, so I decided to take this opportunity to go for a swim in the hole. I was constantly doing underwater backflips while bopping my head in and out and jumping off high rocks into the water. About 30 minutes later, I'm near the shallow end of the water hole when I get a strange and unsettling feeling. I don't know why, but it was just so sudden that I couldn't even make it out. I brushed it off and tried my best to focus on relaxing when I turned to my left to see someone peering from behind a tree. As soon as I made eye contact with him, he quickly turned around and hid back behind the tree. In my mind, I thought that maybe I was on private property after all, but if that were the case, why couldn't he have just told me to leave? The things I remember most about him was the clothes he was wearing. Normally, one would assume that he was a hunter or possibly a hiker, but he wore old torn clothes that didn't look very appealing. I tried not to stare at him, or at least in his general direction, but every minute or so, he kept looking at me, and I could see craze in his red eyes. That's when I began to notice that he kept holding on to what looked like a container of some type. I get out of the water and walk over to go confront him, but as soon as I do, he then throws the container and full on ran into the woods never to be seen again. At this point, I'm extremely freaked out and wasn't sure what to do. Almost immediately, a very foul smell hit me in the face that I could only describe to be rotting flesh. I looked to where he threw the container, and I could see that it was now open. As I stepped closer to it, the smell got even more worse that I could hardly breathe. I began to notice what looked to be raw meat inside of the container. However, the disturbing part was that it still had various parts of skin that obviously wasn't from an animal. At that point, I had the sudden urge to puke, and I ran home to immediately tell my parents. Thankfully, they were now home, and I told them what I had witnessed. I was known to be the type of kid who always fibbed and joked about everything, but they knew that something wasn't right, and my dad went out to go check. Within a half hour, police, detectives, along with several search dogs came to the area and recovered the contents that were inside that container. I was never told as to what they were, but I somewhat already knew, as it was now pretty much obvious. I remember being questioned by the authorities as to what the man I had seen looked like, but I'm not sure if they ever found him. My sister and I never go to that waterhole anymore, and I still don't know who that man I saw was or what his intentions were. When I was 12, something happened to me while home alone with my dog Damien. Damien was a gorgeous saddleback German Shepherd who I basically considered as my best friend. We had moved into a relatively small 2-bedroom house in the country, and the closest neighbor wasn't close by, and I didn't have many friends. One day, my parents had to go out with a few friends to a bar and wouldn't be back for a good few hours. Being only 12 at the time, I obviously wasn't old enough to drink, so I had the house to myself until my parents returned. Sometime during the night, I was on my bed playing some video games. Damien was on my bed, when out of nowhere, Damien perked his ears up. You know that movement dogs do with their ears when they hear something? Yeah, that meant he sensed something nearby. Living next to a forest preserve and a wooded area, I didn't think much of it and dismissed it as him smelling a raccoon or other critters. However, that checked out when he got up and bolted out of my room barking his head off. At this point, I guess I consider myself as worried, as Damien tends to remain calm about these things, so his behavior was odd. Out of curiosity, I get up and walked out of my room to find Damien barking at our basement door. However, his barks became more hostile, as if he were in attack mode. Now, in order to get to the basement door, you'd have to go down the stairs to the den, which had the basement door on the side. I stood there, petrified, standing like a statue as I listened to him bark. German Shepherds are meant to protect anything against their owner and will attack upon command, so I was ready for anything. I finally gathered up the courage to open the basement door, and as soon as I did, I found open beer bottles, bags of chips, food, and a lit cigarette that I was sure was my mom's. Damien then stopped barking and started sniffing around. Even though I didn't see anyone, I was still freaked out because finding a lit cigarette obviously means that someone was recently here. After about a minute of looking around, Damien and I went back upstairs and everything seemed fine. A few hours later, my parents then got home and I explained what I had seen in the basement. My dad, being a pretty big guy, went down there to find that our den door had broken down. In fact, our whole den was beyond trashed. I remember my parents calling the cops, but I don't know what happened after that. It still freaks me out knowing that there had been someone living in our basement eating our food for God knows how long. When my brother and I were around 8 or 9 years old, we lived with our cousins as both our parents were major alcoholics and did very little to provide for us. Ever since then, our cousins had full custody. One of my younger cousins, named Rachel, always had this weird obsession with porcelain dolls. She was 6 years old and very weird. I don't know what it was about her, but she gave off such a strange and unsettling vibe, making you not want to be around her. Coming from a 6-year-old, it's much more disturbing. One night, I was home alone finishing up some homework from my science class, when I heard what I could only describe as loud thuds coming from upstairs. Since I knew I was home alone, I figured that it was the wind, or possibly rain, as there were tropical storm warnings in the area. 5 minutes later, I heard the same noise again, but much more louder. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach, as I feared that there was possibly someone in my house. Even though I was 9 at the time, I was pretty brave, so I went upstairs very quietly to the room where I thought I heard noises, which was my aunt's room. I opened the door to the room, expecting for someone to be there, but I was surprised to find absolutely no one. However, I did find one of Rachel's dolls sitting on the bed, facing directly toward me. I left the room and thought nothing of it and brushed it off, but I for some reason had the urge to open the door again. And once I did, the doll was no longer on the bed, but rather on the floor face down. At this point, I'm clearly freaked out, but I didn't want to be in that room any longer. I didn't tell my aunt or Rachel, thinking that they probably wouldn't believe me, but I know what I saw. I just can't even begin to explain it. This happened to me in late July of 2018 while on a fishing trip with my son. My son was only 8 at the time of the story and he loved fishing, so I wanted to take him out on the water for him to experience what an actual fishing trip was like. To cut to the chase, we took the boat out to sea, miles from the shore, and waited till around 3 a.m. to catch a specific type of fish that only came out during this time. So, my son and I were fishing, and I'd constantly be taking short breaks to move to the spotlight from up top. At one point, I'm on the spotlight when I hear my son say that there's something in the water. I looked to where he was pointing at, and could see something floating in the water about maybe 10 to 15 feet away from the boat. Keep in mind that it's completely dark out, so I grabbed the spotlight and shined it toward the object. To my surprise, it was a small raft made from what looked to be wooden planks with a small tarp on top of it. Upon this raft was not a single soul, and it kinda just looked abandoned, and it honestly reminded me of something straight out of Castaway. I told my now petrified son to step away as the raft then made contact with our boat, creating a big thud. I came down and examined the raft with my flashlight. This made absolutely no sense, and I was getting confused as to why there was a raft this far out at sea. Needless to say, we sailed away from that area and went elsewhere. The scariest thing, however, was the horrible thought about the people who once sailed that raft and how they met their fate. It still freaks me out.
A week or so ago, I went for my very first job interview that I had got called for. It was just a 10-minute bus ride away, and I happened to get a seat alone because it was like 10 a.m., meaning rush hours were well over. So, there I was, 18 and all dressed for the occasion and looking kinda like Amy from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I was sitting there minding my own business, listening to music, when I made eye contact with a man I'd never seen before. He looked to be in his mid-30s, had dark, tightly curled hair, somewhat of a small beard, and a creepo-style mustache. I didn't take any notice until I was getting off, and he got off too, saying, "Hello," to me. Being nice, I said hi back, not taking too much notice, and thanked the bus driver. Straight away, this guy was on me. He began to ask my name and what my number was. I felt really uneasy and creeped out, so I told him I wasn't allowed to tell random strangers that because my parents are very protective. Which is a total lie. They're actually chill when it comes to these things. He then began this pity spiel about how he came from somewhere in India and had no friends or family in Ireland and how he was so lonely. He then asked for my address and I ignored him again, and he was saying how he'd meet my parents and they could get to like him. I instantly lied and said my interview was really soon, when really it actually wasn't for another 50 minutes, but whatever. Made a good impression by being early. I came out afterwards feeling good, and this dude was waiting outside for me. He began to stroll around with me and followed me into the pharmacy because I needed to buy something. He then began telling me how he worked as a chef in a resort in the village and he would bring me for tea. I lied once again and told him I had no money, to which he said he'd pay for me because the bus wouldn't be there for another hour. Of course, I declined and said I wanted to have a walk around by myself because my friends living nearby would be meeting me. Lies. After I told him that, he thankfully turned around and walked away, and I never saw him again. So, I grew up in Las Vegas. I'd moved there when I was in the second grade. I was around 7 or so. My mother was working at some sort of motorcycle repair shop in Arizona that just wasn't paying the bills all too well. She jumped at the offer of a new job, of course. Fast forward about 5 years. I'm in middle school now. My brother and I were almost exactly 2 years apart, and I was about to turn 12, so he was 10 at the time. My mother, being quite low on the seniority list, was forced to work late nights, which left me and my brother home alone after school more often than not. Our nights were usually pretty uneventful, usually consisted of us avoiding whatever homework was assigned, warming up leftovers in the microwave, and watching whatever sparked our interest on the TV. We usually ended up in bed before our mom got home, but occasionally we'd wait up for her. One night, or I suppose one afternoon, considering it was still broad daylight, everything was pretty normal. My brother sat on the living room floor, engulfed in whatever was on the TV, and I was using my mom's desktop computer feeding my virtual pets. Then, all of a sudden, there was a rather aggressive knock at the door. I was sort of an outcast child. I didn't really have too many friends, nor did my brother. Even then, we lived in what you would consider a senior living community. My mother was the youngest adult there and was around her mid-30s. My brother, being too short to reach the peephole, doesn't move, only slightly reacts and looks at me. I get up from the computer chair and make my way to the front door to glance out the peephole. I see a man in a black ski mask staring back at me through the peephole. It definitely doesn't seem real. It sort of seemed like something from a cliché movie, as if he was dressed to rob a bank. I was immediately scared, and I obviously didn't bother asking who it was. I silently stepped away, shut the TV off, grabbed my brother and our small black Pomeranian, and ran towards my bedroom. Once we were safely hidden in my closet, I informed him of what I saw outside. He didn't say much, but was visibly shook up, just quietly stood there holding our dog. I slid the tiny flip phone our mom left us for emergencies from my pocket and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator the entirety of the call, as I didn't think that the man had left considering the knocks persisted after we left the living room. Yet somehow she understood me and sent an officer over. Immediately after the call ended with the operator, I dialed for our mother. I explained everything to her. She ended up leaving work early and ended up home around the same time the police had. I'm not quite sure what deterred him of pursuing further, but of course, the man was gone by the time they both had arrived. The officer was very clearly not taking any of it seriously, most likely thinking these two young boys were just paranoid from staying home alone. "It was probably some young man playing a joke on a friend of his," was his explanation. However, like I stated previously, we lived in a senior living community. Who could he possibly be playing a joke on? His dear grandmother? He then gave my brother and I stickers, as if this would console our nerves after seeing some masked madman pounding on our door. Fortunately, I never saw the stranger after that. After that experience, my house, however, had been broken into, as well as my car 3 times. Thankfully, none of us were present when any of this took place. Since, my family and I have moved out of state and installed a security system. So this happened to me a few years ago when I was a freshman in college. I'm now a junior, and it's still insane to think about. At this point in my 20-year-old female young adult life, I've been around the block and I've definitely had lots of freaky encounters with men since entering college, but I've always considered this one to be one of the worst. For a little background, I go to school in the Boston area, and there's a local burger chain that has a few locations sprinkled around the city. I believe they have a partnership with Fenway, so it's a fairly popular business and I loved going there with my friends in the first few months I was at the college. One Saturday night in December, I went there with a few friends after we'd smoked a little weed and wanted to get something to eat. We walked in and it was pretty crowded, so we all got in line and waited the order. Something I've discovered about myself since being in college and dealing with lots of creepy guys is that I have a really strong sense of intuition, and I can honestly tell when someone's going to be weird with me. We'd eventually advanced towards the front of the line and there was only one register open. One of the men working in the kitchen, it's an open kitchen concept, saw me and came over to open another register before calling me over. I was waiting in line behind my friend, who was just one person away from being at the register, so I thought it was odd that he hasn't asked her to come over since she was next in line. Plus, the line had died down at that point, and a second register wasn't really needed, especially since they only had one when the line was longer. So, I already knew something was up, but I figured it was going to be a typical being a hit-on experience, so I tried not to worry. I got to the register and he started chatting me up, asking how my night was, etc. I tried to be polite, but really focused more on ordering my hot dog, so I gave him my order and paid with my credit card. As is customary, 2 receipts were printed out, one of which being for the business to keep. This is important. I took my own receipt and went to sit down with my friends until my order was called. I honestly didn't remember if he took any orders after mine, but regardless, while I was waiting, I noticed he kept stealing looks at me and I tried to brush it off. Another employee was bringing out trays and calling orders. Some of my friends had just gotten their food. Eventually, my order was finished, and the man from the register realized it was mine and brought it over to the counter himself to give it to me personally. I didn't even look at him in the face when I took it because I had such a weird feeling about the whole thing that kept getting worse. While we sat there eating, he kept staring at me and I mentioned it to my friends, but they tried to reassure me and told me not to worry because they were there. When we mostly finished, he came over and offered to throw away our trash, specifically mine at first, to which we declined. It was still packed, and it wasn't really normal that this guy was trying so hard to cater to one group and not everyone else, especially when he was supposed to be in the kitchen. We left and things seemed fine, but I kept having this feeling that something bad was going to happen and the situation hadn't really ended. The next day, I was busy doing some studio work in a short film. I'm an animation major, so I was at the arts building for most of the morning. Once I came home, I took a nap because I had been animating basically all day, and I woke up around 5 p.m. I checked my phone to see what time it was, and I saw that I had gotten a request on Facebook Messenger. I didn't recognize the name, but I could honestly say that in the back of my mind, I had a horrible feeling that it was the cashier guy from the night before. And I was right. I opened Messenger, looked at his Facebook profile picture, and immediately felt one of those most sickening, shocked feelings I had ever felt. I looked through his photos, still absolutely shocked, and basically had an anxiety attack. He had sent me a friend request and multiple messages that said exactly this.
"Oh my god, no way, I can't believe this is you." "I believe so, but LOL, I was scrolling through Facebooks and I believe I seen you yesterday."
He then tried to add me on Messenger.
"I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. I'm just like in shock you popped up. LMAO."
There is legitimately no way that he wasn't intentionally searching for my profile for numerous reasons. First, the Facebook algorithm really only shows you people that you might know through mutual friends. I was 18 at the time, and all my recommended friends had either gone to school with me or had mutual friends. There were literally pictures of me at my high school graduation from that year. This guy was almost 30 years old, clearly knew how young I was, and had no mutual friends and lived nowhere near me. And second, my profile picture at the time was my dog, so he wouldn't have known it was me unless he'd purposely looked me up. None of that just scrolling through. And lastly, I'm only one of 2 people on Facebook with the name with my last name, so it's really hard to spell. There's seriously no way you'd find me without actually looking. So of course, I was absolutely terrified and was trying to figure out how he'd possibly tracked me down. But then I remembered the second receipt, and how I used my credit card and how my name was printed on the paper. That was the only way he could have figured it out, so I assumed he kept that receipt for himself or wrote my name down for later. And then, I remembered that I had worn my college sweatshirt at the restaurant that night, and how my college was also listed on my profile. It was literally just a few minutes down the road from where he worked. Panicking, I told my friends, who were also incredibly shocked, and we tried to figure out what to do. We went and ate at the dining hall, discussing what had happened, and eventually I ended up back in my dorm. Upon getting to my room, I realized he'd tried to video chat with me while I was at dinner, following up with,
Didn't mean that.
but I'm sure he would have meant it if I had answered. We ended up calling the restaurant and got stuck listening to a directory, so my friend left a message explaining the situation. I was too freaked out, and we hoped for an eventual response. They literally never got back to us. Meanwhile, I called my other friend, who commutes from home, and told her about what had happened. She told her mom, who immediately called the restaurant and actually got through to a person on the other line. She explained the situation, and they seriously didn't even do anything. All she got was a half-hearted, "Yeah, we'll talk to him," but said they wouldn't fire him, and nothing more. There was no real feeling of resolution there. During this whole thing, he sent me another message around 10:30, clearly desperate to pry a response out of me.
I'm just so curious if it's you.
Needless to say, I was extremely freaked out by this whole thing, and of course never responded and took screenshots of everything and went to the campus security the next day just to give him a description of the guy, just in case. I ended up not finishing my film and showing up late to the class because I was literally too petrified to leave the house. Luckily, my teacher was understanding. I do know that somebody clearly did talk to him because he blocked me on Facebook a few days later, but I still felt uneasy. Time went on, and I eventually felt better about the whole thing, but my friends and I had never gone back to that restaurant. It was kind of a bummer because I really liked it there, but I was advised by the campus security to stay away. Plus, I wasn't really keen on potentially running into him again anyways. I've since made my profile more private, and a lot of my information is now hidden from public view. I was also afraid to use my credit card for a while, which sucked, but it's not an issue anymore.
This is a story when I used to live in Thailand. I'm pretty young, and this scared me a lot as this was something that no one should ever go through. It all started when my parents took us for a vacation to a hotel right on the beach, which was surprisingly a lot cheaper than we expected. On top of that, the hotel we were staying at was about 3 minutes in walking distance from the beach, which thankfully made it much easier. The first night was nice, but at around 2 a.m., I hear what sounds like a kid scream from down the hall. I forgot to mention that this hotel had some kids, but why would they be screaming at this time of night in the hallway? The noise woke me from my sleep. I got a bit scared, but didn't have the guts to wake up my parents who were sleeping in the next room over. The screaming finally stopped, But I then heard it again, this time much more loud and distorted. When I woke up, I felt around for my phone, but I couldn't find it. Suddenly, the lamp I had left on by my bed had turned off by itself. I was really skeptical about that and figured that it must have been some sort of outage, but that checked out when I hear clear as day cries from the same child coming from inside the room. I got the hell out of that room and went to my parents, but instead of supporting me, they started lecturing me about how I was hearing things and how I wasn't getting enough sleep. The next day, we met a man that lived next to the hotel, and at one point, I was talking with him about what I had witnessed the previous night. Now, I'm not sure if what he said next was true or not, but it ultimately freaked me the hell out. Apparently, a few years ago, there was a young boy and his family who stayed at the same hotel as I did for vacation. At one point, the boy had been playing near the elevator, which was being worked on at the time. He unfortunately got too close and plunged to his death down the elevator shaft. Ever since then, there had been multiple reports of people hearing screams. The screams of a child during the night while asleep. What he said still gives me chills to this day. I have never believed in the paranormal, but I have absolutely no other explanation.